Welcome back, everyone. Adam Lafacci, your moderator, rejoining you, and thank you so much for joining us for the third session in Diplomacy in Action, the online conference that has been taking place throughout the day today. We're going to talk a little bit about our third and final session in just a moment, but first I want to cover a few technical aspects of the online room with you, starting with the chat on the left side of the screen. You can use that chat box to enter in your questions or comments as we move through the session today. And if you have any technical issues, you can let me know there as well, and I'll respond to you privately to get those sorted out as quickly as possible. If for any reason you have a larger tech issue and you're not able to communicate with me in the chat, you can always email us at smithsonian@learningtimes.com, and our team will be watching that email, respond to you, and get you back in the online room as quickly as possible. Here's a look at the sessions we've had today. We started off at the diplomatic reception rooms with practicing diplomacy from early America to the present, and then moved over to the National Park Service offices for places of negotiation. If you missed those sessions or you'd like to review them, we will have those archives posted within 24 hours, so we encourage you to both check out those recordings yourselves and share them with any students or colleagues or friends that may want to join. If you'd like to know any more information on the conference, you can go to the link here on the screen as well to learn more. This conference is part of the Interagency Initiative on Learning, and here you'll see former Secretary Clinton signing that declaration with some of the other signatories. Now, all of the sessions of this conference are connected to multiple Smithsonian quests, and I actually have Ashley Naranjo joining us from the Smithsonian now, who will talk to us a little bit more about the quests and badges that you can earn and take part in.
Thanks so much, Adam. So like Adam said, we have additional learning extensions that are available for these sessions, and they can be found through smithsonianquest.org. And you can see here that there's a number of different topics that we cover from multiple different perspectives. There's currently 24 badges, and each badge offers 2 to 4 different activities for students to explore. And you can see that our most recent badge is actually the Diplomat badge. Teachers have been telling us how much they love the quests and how they appeal to many different types of learners. And allow students to actually choose quests that fit their specific skill sets, as well as explore their interests through the Smithsonian and other museum resources. The Diplomacy in Action badge is available at the Smithsonian Quest site, and you'll come to a page that looks very similar to this. And when you click on the badge, you'll see the 3 different options. The first is the Junior Diplomat Quest, which was created in collaboration with the diplomatic reception rooms of the U.S. Department of State, and it highlights the international role of diplomacy, as well as highlighting some of the artifacts that go along with it. Next up, we have the Place Matters Quest, and this highlights how place really does change the way that negotiations happen and world leaders reach agreements. And finally, the quest that accompanies today's presentation is Messages of a Movement, and we look at different media types and examples throughout history, and specifically throughout the civil rights movement, and how they portray the messages of the actual movement. So we look forward to having you join us for this session, and like Adam said, please feel free to visit the link on your screen, smithsonianeducationconferences.org/diplomacy. Where you can find more information as well as resources for the sessions.
Wonderful, and thank you, Ashley. And we are now going live to the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. And we're going to be hearing from Harry R. Rubenstein, who's joining us from the National Museum of American History. Thank you so much for joining us today, Harry.
Oh, it's a pleasure to be here. I guess I'll launch in. And you know, in many respects, this is a story as much about diplomatic history as probably any of the others that were discussed earlier today. This is really how large groups of people negotiate and participate in their society with those in power to make significant changes. I mean, we're going to talk about 2 events that took place 100 years apart that are really pivotal events that changed the very nature of the country. The Smithsonian realized that there was an anniversary coming up to commemorate both the Emancipation Proclamation in 1863 and the March on Washington in 1963. It was the 100th and 50th anniversary of one and the 50th of the other. These are two events that were linked, not just by the years, but were very consciously linked in terms of the March on Washington by the organizers themselves. And so we went ahead and we put together an exhibit that looks at these two pivotal events. You're seeing the entrance of that gallery. And by examining these two events, I think you get a real sense of how change happens in America and how really these become our grand people's movements. Let's start with the Emancipation Proclamation. And to understand why it is so important, one has to really understand the place of slavery in the nation prior to it. You know, slavery was an economic system, not just a social system. It's not just a repressive system. It really is the basis of the country. It's keyed into the formation of the nation itself. It's an economic system that has impacts across not only the South, but clearly the North as well. And it is a movement that was challenged by people from its very beginning, both those enslaved, but also those who recognized the corrosive nature of slavery in a democratic nation. People opposed slavery on many different forms. Those enslaved led rebellions, created their own societies and social life that challenged the institution of slavery. Across the country, there were also those who opposed it in political ways, also in violent ways. But it's not really until the crisis of the Civil War that this issue of slavery comes to a head. What you're seeing is the attack on Fort Sumner in April 1861. And this is really what begins the Civil War in a formal sense. Obviously, the election of Abraham Lincoln does that as well, and the North and the South are divided in that election. As soon as the war begins, you start to see enslaved people from the plantations of the South crossing into Union lines. In a sense, they're people on a march. They're marching and demanding their own freedom. They realize, as most Americans realize, that at its core, the Civil War was about slavery, and whether the nation would either become a nation that was either all slaves, slavery existed across the nation, or existed nowhere. That was really at its core one of the central issues of the Civil War. And African Americans realized, as they did at other moments of great crisis, that this was an opportunity for them to demand their own emancipation. I think people know a lot of the story, but sort of as a surprise to me as I was doing research on this, how large this migration really took. And what you're seeing here is an encampment of formerly enslaved people living in tent cities. Here's actually one of the few remaining tents from one of those tent cities. And these are actually very large tents. They may be held as many as 16 people. And the cities themselves began to form, in which there were tens and thousands of individuals, large, in a modern sense, refugee camps from the war. And this was one of the added pressures on the North and on Abraham Lincoln to resolve. Now that the war has begun, now that you have these large refugee camps, what do you do with these people? Clearly, the war that was about union quickly becomes a war that's also about slavery and resolving the issue that had divided the nation through most of its existence. In the summer of 1862, I should say, Abraham Lincoln goes to the telegraph office, which is near the White House, and begins using this inkwell to draft what has become known as the Emancipation Proclamation. Here you see a print of Abraham Lincoln, who is presenting to his cabinet members the draft that he had been working on of the Emancipation Proclamation. What this does is it declares that those enslaved within the Confederacy and those areas still under rebellion would become free by executive order. Basically, the argument is that this is a resource for the Confederacy, the slave labor, and it could be confiscated under the rules of war. Everyone realized, however, that this was more than just simply an act of war, that once the Emancipation Proclamation actually would take effect, if the Union won, that in fact slavery would be abolished in the United States. Some saw this as a last-ditch effort of the Union, and Lincoln, and you see in this cartoon, is being criticized. It's sort of his last card to be played against the Confederacy, a desperate act, not one that he truly believed was something that should be done because of moral reasons, but rather just for the needs of war. Lincoln himself had been opposed to slavery throughout his entire life, and he recognized that beyond just the needs of the war, that in fact it was tearing the nation apart, and the only way to resolve the issues of the Civil War was to deal with slavery. So he issues a preliminary draft that basically states that if the Confederacy does not rejoin the Union, does not unconditionally surrender, that he will enact the Emancipation Proclamation, and that they have until January 1st to either return to the Union or face the proclamation. And as you know, the war continues. The South rejects this act, and on January 1st, 1863, Lincoln signs the Emancipation Proclamation. And this not only changes the nature of the war, it really changes the nature of the country itself. There's one other aspect beyond declaring those in the Confederacy free. it also opens up union enlistment to African Americans. While these figures are actually wearing gray uniforms, this is a recruitment poster for African Americans to join the Union, and those are actually Union uniforms. And they do. And they join and participate in their own liberation and the liberation of their families and fellow countrymen. The success of the Emancipation Proclamation, as you know, leads to a series of other things. It leads to the 13th Amendment, which abolishes slavery. It leads to the 14th and 15th Amendment as well, and really a change of the nation. But what does emancipation mean? And that was a question that the next generation had to decide. Once free, clearly there was a strong reaction, and what you're seeing is a graphic of two members of what was known as the early Ku Klux Klan. As soon as the war ended, you start to see these vigilante groups forming to limit the amount of freedom and opportunity that the recently freed enslaved people were granted. And a fight happens over what does freedom mean to this new population. As you know, many of the promises of free citizenship to African Americans after the war are not fulfilled. And slowly, many of the basic rights of African Americans begin to become eroded. But within the African American community, the promise of freedom, of full citizenship, continued. And throughout the country, at different communities, African Americans would gather on Emancipation Day and hold various forms of celebrations and marches and celebrations, reminding the nation that the promise of emancipation had not been fulfilled. What you're seeing here is one of those grand processions. This happened in Richmond, Virginia in 1905. And these ongoing demonstrations, this ongoing demand for freedom, leads us to 100 years later from the Emancipation Proclamation, the March on Washington.
You know, when you think about the march, it really is an amazing event on many levels. Nobody had done a march like this, ever tried to do a demonstration like this before. The idea was to bring over 100,000 people to Washington to make a demand for basically full citizenship. African Americans had been barred from various occupations, from being able to use various public accommodations like restaurants and movie theaters, the demands for equal voting rights, a whole array of things that we take for granted as Americans were things that they were very clearly, sometimes by law, sometimes by custom, barred from. And this was a demand to change all of that, in a sense, to fulfill the promise of the Emancipation Proclamation. So 100 years to celebrate that anniversary, the civil rights organizations across the political spectrum came together. A. Philip Randolph was the organizer behind this, the elder statesman of the civil rights movement. He pulled together the organizations, whether it was Martin Luther King, the NAACP, student organizing groups, all into one moment in time. What's amazing is they call for this march in July for a march in August. And they turn to what was known as the most gifted organizer within the civil rights movement, Bayard Rustin, to pull this all together. And in an office in Harlem, New York, he starts to make telephone calls, brings people together, and all of these civil rights organizations that had been working over the years make this national call. And then they're joined by various white civil rights groups and labor organizations and religious organizations, and the call goes out. And they wait and see what happens. There's this wonderful story of Baird Rustin on the Mall, and nobody is there. It's dawn, and a reporter comes up to him, and they say, well, what's going on? And he pulls out a piece of paper, which is actually a blank piece of paper, and he turns to the reporter and says, no, everything's on schedule. During that day and that morning, buses come from every state in the Union, and trains are coming from everywhere, and hundreds of thousands of people. So this desire to have at least 100,000 as a marking point, over 250,000 people come to Washington, fill the mall, black and white, students and elder people descend on the mall and hear a set of incredibly inspirational speeches. And of course, it's capped off with Martin Luther King's great I Had a Dream speech that inspired everybody in the crowd. I mean, you talk to people who were there that day or heard it on television, and they still remember how they felt when they heard those words, whether they were in their living room or on the mall. The march is not only for Washington. It's the first time, really, that the national networks are able, because of satellite systems, to telecast this live across not only the nation, but the world. And so people see this incredible group of peaceful protests making their demand. And I think in very significant ways, it shifts the dialogue. People had become accustomed to seeing these very violent demonstrations and police hosing students in Birmingham. But to see this sort of large, peaceful gathering on the mall really changes not only people's minds in Washington, but around the country. And it really helps to lead for the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965.
And before we move on, we actually have a couple of questions for all of you. We're going to start by launching an interactive poll in the top left-hand corner of the screen. And now that you've seen that video, we're wondering, have you ever marched or joined a demonstration for a cause? And you'll notice that you can click the gray bubble that best corresponds to your answer. Wow, and I'm seeing a very early lead with 100% so far saying yes. We're still sticking close to that percentage. And while you're all taking a moment to answer that, we also have a question in the chat box that we'd love to hear your thoughts on. Can you think of examples in your lifetime where everyday citizens rose up to change something in their lives? And we'll check back in with you in a little bit to see some of the responses that have popped into the chat. So please feel free to share your thoughts with us there.
Okay. Well, this is Harry Rubenstein again. It was no wonder, no surprise why the organizers for the March on Washington chose the Lincoln Memorial for this event. Clearly, they wanted to tie the event to the anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. And what better place to do this than the memorial for the great emancipator, as he was known then, Abraham Lincoln. But there's also a history to the memorial itself that led these organizers that's worth sort of thinking about and really made the Lincoln Memorial a stage for national civil rights movements. At its dedication in 1922, and you're seeing the program from that, Robert Moton, president of Tuskegee Institute, delivered the keynote address. And it probably is the first civil rights speech at the memorial, even though it was done before a segregated crowd. The second event that probably spurred the organizers to select the Lincoln Memorial was Marian Anderson's open-air concert. As many of you know, she was barred from singing in Constitutional Hall in Washington, D.C., and the Roosevelt administration offered her a public space to hold her Easter Day concert in 1939. And there she is. It was recorded throughout the country. People listened to it on the radio. It was recorded and distributed internationally. It was really a challenge to segregated Washington that this event took place. There had been earlier suggestions of a national march. The earliest was in 1941, and here you see a button from a march that never took place. A. Philip Randolph, who will be involved in the 1963 march, tried to organize this march. And this was really to open up jobs during World War II for African Americans. It looked as if this was going to be a major event in Washington. And just days before the march was to take place, Roosevelt offered the organizers of the march a negotiated deal that he would open up federal jobs in defense plants if they called off the march. And so days before the march was to take place, Roosevelt issues an executive order opening up these jobs, and A. Philip Randolph calls off the march in 1941. And then there's one other attempt, or one other event, and that was the prayer pilgrimage in 1957. This was to remind people that, in fact, that the promise of Brown v. Board of Education, which was to desegregate the schools, hadn't been fulfilled in the years that followed. And they were making a demand that the promise of school desegregation would be fulfilled. It's the largest demonstration of its time for civil rights, and about 50,000 people show up. And many of the leaders of that march or that event are present in 1963 when they reorganize it. A. Philip Randolph is one of the principal organizers. The NAACP is actively involved in the event, and Martin Luther King gives his first major address before the public. But it is really a very different kind of thing in 1963 when they make this call for the March on Washington. And, you know, I've always been amazed in thinking about this march. What you see before you are the principal organizers of the march. These are the individuals representing the major civil rights organizations of their day. They meet in a hotel in New York City in July, and they announce that they are going to create the largest civil rights march in the country's history. The individuals gathered around this table include, from left to right, John Lewis, who was the director of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and really represents the student activists of his day. He actually is now a congressman representing a district in Atlanta, and is the only living member of this group. Next to him is Whitney Young, executive director of the National Urban League. In the center is A. Philip Randolph, who in many respects, while president of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and other sort of labor organizations and committees, really represents himself. He is the elder statesman of the civil rights movement of his day. And it's really his vision to call this march that brings these other individuals together. You probably all recognize the young Martin Luther King next to A. Philip Randolph, representing probably more than anything else himself, but also he served as president of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Next to him is James L. Farmer, who was the national director of the Congress of Racial Equality, another major civil rights organization of its day. And then finally, there's Roy Wilkins, executive director of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, better known as the NAACP. And there they are, calling for a march just less than 2 months away. And as the video that you just saw mentioned, in order to make this march possible, they enlist probably the most gifted organizer of the civil rights movement, Bayard Rustin, who had been present in so many demonstrations helping to organize them. And each one of the organizations under his leadership sends people up to this headquarters in Harlem, New York, and they begin to organize and make a call. And, you know, when you think about it, you have to remember that this is a very different age than the one we live in. There is no internet, there is no social media. Phone calls across the country cost a lot of money. Sending people around the country. You know, even in this day, this is the day still where airfare was largely for the very rich. And people traveled mostly by buses and trains. And what it demonstrates is the deep organizations within the civil rights movement of its day. What made it possible for the march to be successful is that they could call on a large group of community organizations, church groups, labor organizations, student movements, all that had been organizing and thinking about this day since emancipation. It really is one of those deep-seated movements that had such deep roots that, in fact, they were able to make a call and people came. Now, here you see a cartoon sort of representing, in a sense, what people feared. What would happen if you brought all those people to Washington? And no one really knew. And no one knew between not only the administration, but actually the organizers themselves. This had never been done. The largest demonstration, as I mentioned, was a fifth the size of this. These people would be traveling to Washington through some of the most hostile areas for civil rights workers to go through the South. Nonetheless, a call came out, and the city sort of waited to see what would happen. The Kennedy administration, which was very fearful at the beginning but very supportive once the march was going to happen, organizes the military to encircle the city, and if some outbreak happened, they would swoop down and restore peace. The city itself closed all its liquor stores and bars, not knowing what would happen when this large crowd came. And they did come. And they came from every corner of the nation. And as the video showed, from every age group, every ethnicity, black and white, old and young, and held a demonstration that changed the very nature of how civil rights was thought of and discussed in the country. It's not as if this wasn't a burning issue that people had discussed, but one of the things that coincided with this was the beginning of an international communications satellite system. And so people could actually watch this march as it was happening. And so it not only engulfed the city of Washington, it engulfed the nation. And it was exactly what the marchers had hoped for, that the need for bringing these local civil rights demands out of their communities and before the nation. And so beyond just marching around the city from the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial, it was really a march that was witnessed by everyone. And in that march was a program that was distributed by the tens of thousands to everyone who came. But the point that I want to mention here is that it was clearly as much about people negotiating with their country, their society, with their government. And so they had a very clear sense of demands, the way that anyone, in a sense, when entering into negotiations have. And so here you have on the screen what were the basic demands of the march. And behind these individual demands for greater accommodation, access to all public facilities on an equal basis, desegregation of the schools in the country, enforcement of the laws that protected individuals, all of these basic, and you can read them here, is this underlying demand, which is to have the full rights of citizenship that everyone else had, to share, in a sense, the privileges of American citizenship to all citizens of the country. And that was really the basic demand behind the march. And not only did they make this demand, they asked people who were there to pledge their support and their ongoing work for this. And that's really at the core what this was all about. The success of the march is unquestionable in my mind. It changes the very nature in which people thought of the civil rights movement. It made it a national issue, not just an issue of the South, and it helps to propel a series of legislations that really changes America. The Civil Rights Act of 1964, of which this flyer was for a celebration, a concert that took place. The Voting Rights Act of 1965, the following year. These things change and make the society that we know today. Clearly, though, that everyone who was present knew that this struggle was not going to end while these pieces of legislation changed the structure of discrimination and segregation in the country. It certainly doesn't end it. It's still issues that we deal with today, and in a sense, they offer a sense of a promise of what we hope will be, and we still are working towards. The other aspect of the march is that immediately society sees this as an inspiration for social movements on many different levels and across the political spectrum. In seeing the success and the impact of the march, led others to demand their rights and what they would consider free access and full citizenship. You see just a sampling of some buttons that were in some respects inspired by the March on Washington. Whether it's for Indian rights, disabilities rights, gay rights, labor unions, women's rights, and in this grouping for the rights of senior citizens. Many others as well looked at the march, listened to these incredibly inspiring speeches, and said, we should do the same thing. We need to express our views. Just 2 years later, you have the first public demonstration for gay rights in front of the White House. And in talking to some of the organizers of that demonstration, they were at the March on Washington, and they basically said, we need to do the same thing. The women's movement is clearly inspired by the civil rights movement. The demand for equal rights clearly follows on the demands for civil rights. And it goes across into other communities. Here you see a picture of Native Americans at Gallup, New Mexico in 1973. Just 10 years afterwards, inspired by seeing those same images of the March on Washington, they too say we need to march and express our demand for equal and full rights of citizenship. So that's sort of what the exhibit tried to achieve. That's what we learned by doing the exhibit. I think the major message that we learned when we did the research on this is these were really important and powerful lessons in people's movements. That while in fact they were organized and many of the demands were, facilitated by gifted and talented leaders, they were really people's movements. There's a clear link between the people who marched across Union lines for emancipation to those who marched in Washington, to those who march today, that they're sort of inspirational movements, and it shows and demonstrates the power of everyday average people coming together to change the world in a way that they feel is better. And it's in many respects what our American democracy is all about. This notion that the everyday average citizen participates in the system, negotiates with those in power to express their voice and their opinions. So thank you, and I assume that we'll have some questions and discussion at this point.
Yeah, that's wonderful. And we've gotten a few responses into some of the questions we were asking along the way. First off, I want to point out that we asked, have you ever marched or joined a demonstration for a cause? And about 64% of the people that are joining us today have, which sounds like a pretty good number to me, pretty solid.
Yes, absolutely. And, there's lots of ways of participating in this democracy. And so those who haven't, I would just sort of urge not necessarily to march, but that find ways in which you make your voice heard. One of the amazing things about American history is you can look across that large spectrum, and those both young students and those who have the vote and those who don't have the vote have found ways to participate in their society and making their voice heard. And so there's many ways. I know that we have a lot of young students listening as well. And, there's a long history of people who are outside of the political system actually engaged in the political system.
That's great. And we actually asked all of you a little earlier if you had examples that you could cite from your lives and or just recent historical examples that you saw on the news. And a couple have popped up here, Arab Spring, large-scale protests at the end of Vietnam, also the Occupy movement that sprung up in New York and across the country. A few big ones from further back and from very recently.
Yeah, it's a long sort of tradition of how do you engage in this democratic process. And built within the Constitution is this idea of the right to petition. It's one of the keystones in the Bill of Rights in this country, and these are largely people petitioning with their feet and exercising that very basic right that the founding generation established in the country.
It's interesting because it seems like there can be frustration with people feeling powerless when they just view voting as possibly their only way of reaching out to shape things politically. But I think it's clear that many groups have found many more tools along the way.
Yes, no, absolutely. And it is that way in which people negotiate and make their case. And what is clear and what was so inspirational to other groups about the March on Washington, but also you can see it other times, is that this, as it has been, a very effective way of making your demands, your petitions, and moving them forward. And one cannot lessen the sense of that these are often difficult struggles. Um, One really has to recognize that oftentimes these were not easy things to do or easy to organize. I mean, they just don't sort of pop up in some ways. I mean, it's years of organizing and thinking and making connections with community members, talking to your friends and associates and family members and across large groups to work together. And in a sense, that's the core of American democracy.
Yeah, and that echoes Betsy's point, which just came into the chat here, that the movement probably needed to develop a strong infrastructure for this to be possible. There were lots of moving parts, and it was really cool to have a kind of behind-the-scenes look at the March on Washington and some of the moving parts that helped make that happen.
Yes, and you can't, the more you know about these events, the more you can't be just amazed and so appreciative and understand how gifted so many people, everyday citizens, were in making this happen.
I see Stevie in DC is citing a few other ways of getting involved and engaged: petitions, letters to newspapers, making posters, volunteering for an action organization are all important ways to make your voice heard. That's a great point. Nice way of building on these examples that we've looked at today. Interesting question here that's come in from Linda, wondering, how do you connect demonstrating for a cause to the theme of diplomacy? What are the threads there for you?
To me, it's that simple notion of groups of people. In many respects, diplomacy is people representing different points of view, often trying to negotiate to resolve a basic issue. And this is really people often out of power trying to negotiate with people in power a set of issues and demands, to bring these before them and force the issue of discussion. One thing that these demonstrations really do is it forces people to both recognize the issues, but forces a dialogue on the issues. And that, in many respects, these demonstrations are a form of discussion between different groups. It doesn't always happen as two people in a closed room discussing these things, but clearly there is one group making a set of claims or putting forward a set of issues that they want discussed, and others, in this case Congress or presidency, trying to address those. And there really is a back and forth. If you can look at the civil rights movement in the 1960s, you see this sort of back and forth between civil rights organizers and participants with the powers that be in government and in their communities, and forcing sort of a dialogue. And clearly what, the point of the March on Washington was to force a national dialogue on
And that's really such a great point that you bring up, because we've been looking today at these really fantastic places where negotiation has taken place, and some of the objects that have been exchanged to help facilitate or cement or commemorate these negotiations. But the question that you're really addressing here for us as well is, why did these people end up in this room discussing this issue? And it's great to see the grassroots human aspect that pushes these issues to the forefront of the political mind.
Right. No, absolutely. And you can look at the sort of the March on Washington button and the signs that they carried as tools of diplomacy. You know, that these are clearly objects that were crafted to create a dialogue, to force a dialogue, and to encourage people to listen to them and to listen to each other. And, you know, obviously it's a process of also people learning about each other. And that's, you know, one of the things about the March on Washington that I think really reshapes the dialogue that took place is that people saw the civil rights movement in a new context. And so it's sort of this introduction of them to the nation in a way that they hadn't seen before. And in a sense, diplomacy is also about introducing different parties to each other and getting a better understanding of each party.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for helping us see diplomacy in a broader context and understand it a little bit more from start to the ending result. Yeah, Harry, this has really been a pleasure. Thank you for joining us today.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This was fun.
Wonderful. And before we wrap up, we're actually going to be launching just a couple of things here on the screen for you. We have an evaluation link that we're putting in the top left-hand corner of the screen. So if you did not have a chance to fill this out at an earlier session, we do hope that you'll give us some feedback on the conference today. It's been a pleasure having all of you joining us today to share your thoughts and questions. And we're also going to end with some very special closing comments from Secretary of State John Kerry.
I want to thank you for participating in this conference and working towards your Diplomacy in Action badge. As our nation's chief diplomat, I just want to show you something very special. It's a symbol that I give to foreign leaders when I meet with them to demonstrate my commitment to working together and finding solutions to common challenges. There is great symbolism within this medal. This bald eagle holds 13 arrows and an olive branch, and the eagle's head is turned towards the olive branch, symbolizing our nation's commitment to diplomacy and to peace. When I give this medal to foreign dignitaries, it tells them, I am committed to diplomacy, to working with you, and I value your contributions. Today, you have the opportunity to earn a similar medal, a special digital badge, and when you complete the Diplomacy in Action quests. Earning this badge will demonstrate that you understand the value and the importance of diplomacy, and you are committed to putting it to work in your everyday life. Together, we can use diplomacy to build relationships with others from different backgrounds, to find common ground, and to treat each and every person as a respected member of our global society. Thank you for joining me and beginning your work to make the world a better place through diplomacy.
And I'll just echo that by saying thank you again for joining us, and we do hope that a way you'll continue to connect with this cause is by spreading the information on this conference. We're actually going to have the recordings archived and available for you within 24 hours. And please feel free to share them with colleagues or students or friends, anyone that you think would be interested in checking out the information we've shared with you today. So thank you so much, everyone. Take care and have a great day.